Coming to our third nostalgia trip episode for the original Game Boy, we're already halfway through the system before we have to move on to the Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance. Although I do have some nostalgia for games like Super RC Pro-Am, Speedball 2, Tetris, and Dino Blaster for my personal Game Boy collection, I have to exclude them from the video list. Stronger memories of them belong to other systems. Now, the first three games for today are ones I remember having played on my friend SJ's old Game Boy in the schoolyard some 25 years ago, the first one of them being Radar Mission. This is basically Battleship on steroids, featuring two distinctly different game modes and a good bunch of options to customize your game. Mode A gives you a fairly traditional Battleship-like game, which has some kind of a plotline that progresses through several levels. There's plenty of nice graphics and music to destroy your opponent's ships and other vehicles too, and for a full game it is wise to have at least an hour to spare. Mode B is more like a first-person arcade shooter with power-ups for your submarine. You control your aiming device left and right, shoot torpedoes with the A button, and use your machine gun with the B button. You can also submerge to not only dodge enemy fire, but also view the radar and see what's going on in the big picture. You win by either destroying the entire enemy fleet or just their submarine. If you prefer to have a more traditional game of Battleship on your Game Boy, Nintendo's Battleship from 1992 might be more to your liking. But for a traditional game of Battleship, you can also use pen and papers. I find Radar Mission more to my liking. The next two games were, from what I remember, part of a multi-cart featuring something like 50 games or so. Actually, from the previous two Game Boy episodes, Quirk, Alleyway, Motocross Maniacs, and Quicks also featured on that very cartridge, and like most of those early pirate multi-carts, it featured all of the original Japanese launch titles and some more games up to 1 or 2 years from the console's release. This game here, Head On, was originally a 1979 arcade game, but Game Boy is where I got to know it first. I still think it's the most fitting platform for the game. It's a one-on-one single-screen maze racing game in which you drive around what's basically a circular maze and need to collect all the dots from the arena and try to avoid colliding with your opponent, who is driving in the reverse direction. The only two things you can do here is push one of the buttons to make the car go faster and use the directional pad to change lanes and hope that your opponent doesn't come on the same lane. Head On's original 1990 Game Boy released in Japan and Europe rightfully acknowledged the game originating as a Sega game, but for some reason it was re-released in North America as Power Racer, and the title screen dubbed all references to Sega, probably due to the market competition. Whichever version you happen to know it by, it's a nice little coffee break game, and is in its own way a solid part of the original Game Boy's legacy. Another lightweight game from the multicart that I remember playing a few times is the only version of Soko-Ban that I ever remember playing to any real extent. This version was also released as Boxxle outside of Japan by FCI in 1989. For those few of you still unfamiliar with the concept, Soko-Ban in Japanese means warehouse keeper, if Wikipedia is to be believed, that is, and as such, your job is to push around boxes into their designated places in strangely shaped warehouse areas. The play areas consist of square-based rooms in which you are restricted to moving only horizontally and vertically, and as I said earlier, you push around boxes but you cannot pull them with you. The format of Soko-Ban was created in 1981 by Hiroyuki Imabayashi, and the first commercial game was published in 1982 in Japan for the NEC PC 8801. The game didn't really land elsewhere properly until Spectrum Holobyte released their version for the Apple II, IBM PCs, TRS-80 and Commodore 64. But for me, the only correct platform to play this game is on the Nintendo Game Boy, which suits the format of this particular game perfectly. One of the first games I ever bought for my own Game Boy Color, whenever that was Super Mario Land 2, 6 golden coins from 1992. It's also still one of the rare Game Boy titles from my collection that I have played through, as this purchase happened many years before I had even thought about writing a blog, so my time was less occupied, so completing the game took no more than 2 days for me. Whereas the first Super Mario Land felt like a remake of the first Super Mario Bros., combined with odd bouts of shoot-'em-up thrown in the mix, Super Mario Land 2 takes more after Bros. 3 and Super Mario World. The levels are now more free roamable, the zones can be completed in any order, and there are secrets enough to make you seek them out for weeks if you feel like it. Super Mario Land 2 also features a magic carrot power-up which doesn't appear in any other Mario game, which turns Mario into a bunny that can jump higher by repeated jumps and float down with bunny ears. Most importantly though, Super Mario Land 2 is where the now classic anti-hero, with his own franchise of games, then antagonist Wario, no relation to Mario apparently, is introduced as the main villain in this game. The plot goes, Wario has put an evil spell over Mario's private island and has taken over Mario's castle. You need to collect 6 golden coins to regain access to your castle, defeat Wario in an epic battle and get your castle back. Nothing to it, really. Which I thought was a bit odd at the time and still kinda do. Super Mario Land 2 is the last Mario platformer on the classic Game Boy console starring Mario, because Super Mario Land 3 is Wario's first appearance as the protagonist. It's a game I still don't have in my collection, but will make an appearance in a later episode whenever possible, because that one I still played in the late 90s. I shall end this episode with one of my most recent acquisitions. Although to be precise, my version of The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening is the deluxe version, which was redesigned and expanded for the Game Boy Color, but is also compatible with Super Game Boy. Link's Awakening plays much like A Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo, mostly because the game started being developed as a Game Boy port of A Link to the Past before the team decided to make a completely new adventure instead. Fine by me, as I still think A Link to the Past is the best Zelda game out there, although there is a chance this one might actually surpass its predecessor once I have the chance of putting enough time on it. As with all the other Zelda games, there are certain things that are specific for this particular game. For one, this is the first, and to my knowledge the only, Legend of Zelda game that doesn't take place in the Kingdom of Hyrule, but instead a completely isolated island that is not apparently even in the same world as Hyrule. From what I've read, this is also the only Zelda game that features cameo appearances from other famous Nintendo game characters, of which I've only seen Chomp, the chained dog-like creature from Super Mario Bros. 3 so far, but apparently characters like Yoshi and Kirby also make appearances. There is a certain odd feel about Link's Awakening which cannot be described in a few words, which I really like. It has exactly the sort of dangerously addicting quality to it that all Zelda games seem to have. Although emulation is always an option, I have tried to spare myself the experience until I have it in my collection, and now that I do have it, I haven't been able to play the game too much yet because when I bought the game about 4 months ago, the battery had died, so I couldn't save my progress, and I had to send it for a battery change. Now the footage you have seen here is the farthest I've gotten in the game so far, and I hope to complete the journey before the battery needs to be changed again. Without having seen all that much of it, I can easily claim that Link's Awakening is definitely one of the best Game Boy games in the catalog.